milk makes me a little phlegmy.
Is that because you're lactose intolerant?
No, well, maybe it is, but what was that? Did that sound come from your cup?
That was my cup. My butt is not in the microphone, ladies and
That
gentlemen.
was awesome. Squeaker.
Let's see. I don't know if I can do that again.
No.
Maybe it was like air releasing from the little hole on the other side of the cup
That's
there.
pretty sweet. Hey, everybody.
Can't change that introduction for anything.
Welcome to Camera Academy from Cometa Camera, starring me, Nick, starring me, Nick, and
we're superstars.
Nikolai over here with the squeaking coffee cup.
Yeah, that was interesting. Good job, Dunkin' Donuts. We should make that a feature.
Today we are going to be talking about focusing. And that's a pretty wide-ranging subject. Yes, it is an interesting topic, and there's lots to talk about. So we should get started pretty quickly instead of just, putzing around for the first 10 minutes of the show.
Yeah, let's go for a record and get this done pretty quick.
Well, it's not as though we want to be done quickly, because we'd love to spend tons of time with you, the audience.
Except we talk about nonsense a lot of the time too.
Yeah, although I do want to discuss the most recent WWE Royal Rumble, but we'll save that for after the show.
Okay.
And also I have some thoughts on The Last Jedi.
Yeah, but you're late to the game with that. You literally just watched it.
I know. This is February 2018, and it came out 2 months ago. So I'm not really on the ball. So we'll discuss my thoughts and my criticisms involving the poor editing.
Yes, of course.
Of The Last Jedi.
We're total experts on that.
But anyway, why don't we talk about something that we're a little bit more familiar with and have a little bit more credibility on, and that is photography. And in particular, we're going to talk about focusing today. So just as a little bit of, not history, but a little bit of background information about focusing in case you don't really know how it works. It essentially works by moving the lens elements, the curved pieces of glass inside your lens, back and forth until the light in your lens converges onto the sensor. And when I say converges, what that means is, if you've ever used a magnifying glass to make a little point of light to start a fire, or to
you evil man,
or to burn ants, or to I can't think of any legitimate uses for making a magnifying glass.
I used to burn leaves. I never felt like burning a creature.
No.
With a magnifying glass.
I'm not saying this is something I have personal experience in.
I don't know about that.
I haven't begun my serial killer career yet. But certainly you've heard of it. It has been done. And if you've ever watched Survivor, people start fires with their glasses and stuff like that. So it can be done.
Cheaters.
Yeah, I know. Converging basically means it comes to a point, right? So when the light comes to a point on your image sensor, that's when that light is in focus. And you basically just have to move the elements in your lens around until that happens. And when the light is not in focus, or when it's not converged, when it covers more surface area on your sensor, that's when it's blurry.
Yes.
So that's basically how, technically speaking, focusing works. Now, before we get into focusing, there are other reasons why your pictures may be blurry. There's actually quite a few reasons, and a lot of them have to do with, I don't want to say user error, but
user error.
Or
we've all been there.
Neglecting to read the manual, because that can also happen. But some of those things will be if your subject is moving around, if you are moving around, if you don't have your image stabilization enabled, that can be a reason for blurry.
If you don't have your autofocus enabled.
If you didn't have autofocus enabled, there is a switch usually on your lens or on your camera that can switch it back and forth.
If you're trying to use an incompatible lens on your camera.
That would be a stretch. How many people are trying to do that?
It happens sometimes.
How about if you have a really shallow depth of field on your lens?
That could be it.
You could miss their focus spot.
Very easily. You can miss that focus spot.
If your shutter speed is too slow.
Yeah.
So there's lots of other reasons besides not acquiring proper focus that you could have blurry pictures. So before you call Nick and start, clogging up the tech support line saying my lens doesn't focus, think for a second. There might be some other causes for that.
It's fine. You can call me.
Nick's lonely. He needs company. So, I guess feel free to call him.
I like talking to people.
Check your autofocus switch first. Couldn't hurt. But anyway, there are a couple different types of focus that we're going to focus on in today's show. And the first one of those would be manual focus. This is the tried and true method of acquiring focus with your lens, and it's available on every lens out there. And it is the The most accurate way of achieving focus as long as you have a good eye.
Back in my day, there was no autofocus.
That's right. And we had to use
We
manual
had to
focus
do it
no matter what
manually.
That's right. No
Even
matter
at
what.
the football games.
So when would you use manual focus, and what sort of pros does it have?
The main time, like in our day and age, the main time I use manual focus is at night. Because when there's not a lot of contrast, or there's nothing for the camera to focus on. I might be getting a little ahead of myself here, but we'll go into detail later.
Autofocusing requires light.
Yes.
It needs to be able to see what your subject is in order to achieve focus on
And it needs to be able to see detail in it too.
True.
So at night, the way I shoot, it's very dark. So in order to get focus on something, I usually have to switch my camera to manual focus for that.
And sometimes even if you're in the dark and you have that little assist light, it's a little autofocus assist light on your camera. If you've ever noticed, when you're autofocusing, a little orange light will light up and it'll shine on your subject's face or whatever you're shooting. That's basically there only to assist the camera in acquiring autofocus. Sometimes your subject matter is just too dark for even that to help, especially if there's no detail, like you said. So
I always keep a flashlight handy on me at night too, so I can that works sometimes. You light up your subject, let the camera focus if you have it on autofocus, then turn the light off and shoot. Put it back on manual focus so it doesn't refocus, and then shoot.
But if you don't happen to have a flashlight, you might need to do it manually.
Yep.
You just might have no choice. So low light situations are a great time to bust out the manual focus.
So how about you give us one? What's a good manual focus thing you use it for?
Well, suppose if you're shooting like a solid object, something like solid colors, or areas where there's low contrast. So if you're trying to shoot water, or if you have a very misty day, if you're trying to shoot some cool fog and you don't have anything specifically to focus on, like you don't have actual objects or contrast to focus on, you might use it in that situation.
Also creatively, you might want to use that too.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's see, what's some other ways? If you're shooting through something like a glass window or something like that, but you're trying to focus on someone or something beyond that.
Chain link fences are my nemesis.
Yes. So if you're trying to shoot through a chain link fence and you want to get the subject in focus, but you want to have that cool, blurry chain link fence in your foreground,
right?
Your camera's autofocus is most likely going to try and focus on the chains.
Right, because it's a really contrasty part of the image, especially if you've got a little backlighting.
Or like a glass plane that has maybe some water drops on it. It's going to try and focus on those water drops because that's what's closest to the autofocus point for it. So you'd want to kind of throw that on manual to get past that.
How about achieving a depth of field on a very specific part of your image?
That too.
If, like you just mentioned, water drops, I've seen a lot of pictures where you're getting macro pictures of water droplets on whatever, and you want to focus on a specific drop. Sometimes an autofocus point isn't going to hit that drop. You got to manually focus it if you want to get it on the right spot.
And when we talk about macro photography, autofocus on macro lenses, if anyone's ever used it, is sometimes rather finicky and has a hard time kind of finding a spot where it wants to focus on. So even like when we're taking product photos here, majority of the time I have the camera on manual focus and I'm using the LCD to zoom in and get a proper focus point for my macro photography.
And when you say zoom in, that's something that a lot of new cameras can do, particularly mirrorless ones. They allow you to really fine-tune the focus. So
digital SLRs can do it too.
Yep. One of the main complaints about manual focus for people who didn't really grow up with it is that it's really hard to determine if your subject is actually in focus because what you're looking at is pretty small.
Yep.
So you can be off by a few inches or whatever in your depth of field and you might not nail the focus that you want. So what's great about cameras now is they use electronic viewfinders to allow you to zoom in and get a very precise view of what you're focusing on so that you can nail that focus manually.
Yep, and digital SLRs too. That they all have LCD screens now. Majority of the time you can put that thing in live view and focus with the back of your LCD screen if you're having trouble doing it through the optical viewfinder. I personally am a type 1 diabetic, so my vision tends to like to shift every now and then depending on my blood sugar. So I heavily rely on autofocus a lot of the time, but when I need the manual focus, I do have tools to get past that.
Okay, so If you don't happen to have a big monitor hooked up to your camera, then using that kind of feature on your camera would be really helpful. Another great thing about manual focus is that you can use vintage lenses on a lot of cameras, and you can also use much less expensive lenses that may have really wide apertures or may have creative uses that you wouldn't be able to use, or you might not be able to afford a lens like that if it had autofocus built into it. So you can get them from a lot of third-party companies. Rokinon, Samyang, Optica come to mind.
We just got those. We just got a whole shipment of the new Optica lenses.
When you started saying shipment, I thought you were going to say something else. Like, we got a full load of...
No, I wasn't going to curse.
But
no,
go ahead.
I tested the fisheye and a 35 millimeter on my Fuji X Pro 2, and they're $100 lenses. I think the most expensive one is $130, and the glass on it's pretty good, and it just come out pretty clean. So the only thing that keeps them cheaper is because there's no autofocus system, no motors built into the lenses. So,
but let's say you get one of those lenses and you get they have a 50 millimeter, and I think it's a 1.8 or something like that. Yeah, and you only shoot portraits a few times a year because these go on APS-C cameras, so they would make good portrait lenses. You only shoot a few portraits a year. That's a nice little investment. You don't have to get a dedicated autofocus lens if you're only going to use it a few times a year. So manual focus, great for inexpensive lenses. And again, you can adapt old lenses that have been around for decades, some that people really have a special affinity towards because of the way they look or because of their feel, and you can use those on modern cameras.
Yeah, I'd really like to get an old like a rangefinder lens and put it on my Fuji, but I just haven't seen anything come really across.
Yeah. Well, the adapters can be a little bit expensive, but...
Well, I mean, if you're just doing manual, the adapters aren't very expensive.
Well, that's true. Yeah, it's just an adapter for
But
the mount.
it's finding a good used lens is the problem. Like, that doesn't have fungus or something in it. Well, although you could get one like that could be creative.
You could, but if you wanted to avoid fungus, you should probably get your used equipment at Cometa Camera.
Yes.
So, all right.
If there is fungus in it, we will list it.
Oh, yeah, we'll let you know.
We don't do shady things.
Thanks for informing the audience that we're not crooks.
Well, I'm the person that kind of looks through the used stuff. I double check it, and if I see any kind of spots or something inside a lens, I'll usually put it in the description, FYI, there is fungus, see pictures.
And usually that's only for antique lenses, things like that. So, all right, before we get off topic,
shop at Cometa Camera.
Before we get completely off topic, let's just say a couple things that are not great about manual focus. It's a little bit slower.
Yep.
As we mentioned, well, these days it's a lot slower. For in most situations, autofocus is so fast on most camera systems these days that switching over to manual is something that only old school types who are snooty about their focus will do. And also, if, like we said, in those situations where it really is a little bit useful.
Yeah, and you'll tend to miss focus a lot if you're trying to get a subject really quick.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard. If you don't have it built into your head, all right, that person's 15 millimeters away from me. I need to switch it over to that focus spot, and you miss it.
What did that sound like again? When want to do that again? Like that?
Like my sound effects.
And then one other con there is that it can be a little bit hard to view, but we mentioned there's ways to mitigate that.
Yeah, but it takes a little time.
It does take some time getting used to, especially if you're using an optical viewfinder, and it has a focusing screen in there. And sometimes focusing screens can be a little bit difficult to get used to. So all in all, manual focus is a very good thing to learn. It makes you a better photographer overall.
Absolutely.
And every lens has it, so there's no reason not to use it when the situation arises. That's what I say about that.
Hear, hear.
Yes.
Or what's the new thing? Dilly dilly?
What's that? Pardon?
It's hear, hear. It's the new...
Huzzah?
Yeah, it's kind of that's the new thing.
Isn't that...
Them kids are talking about, yeah.
It sounds like an old thing. It sounds like something someone with a powdered wig would say.
That's what's going around now.
Hear, dilly dilly.
Yep.
What's old is new again.
Yep.
All these kids
it comes around, man.
All these kids now, they're going to be named Agatha and Bertha.
Yeah.
Other names that end with th.
I totally just bought a pair of almost completely full circle lenses. I mean, glasses.
Yes.
I think they look cool. I look like Harry Potter.
Well, did Harry Potter make it cool, or was it one of these things where like steampunk culture made it cool?
I don't know. I just look like an old man, and I like the way it looks.
Well, it fits your personality
It
perfectly.
makes me feel intelligent.
We can sit together and we can criticize the kids these days and their
Yeah.
autofocus and all that stuff. And speaking of
That's just how you know I'm
autofocus,
getting old, but whatever.
let's just get into autofocus now. This is a little bit more of a wide-ranging subject, but we can start just letting you know that autofocus was sort of developed in the late 70s, and then it was introduced into mass-market cameras shortly thereafter. Canon and Nikon, of course, were some of the Minolta were some of the first manufacturers to incorporate autofocus into their camera and lens systems. And
I'm nodding yes.
Yes,
but
he's nodding and he's increasing his insulin or something.
Yeah,
because he's got coffee in one hand,
I have
insulin
coffee
in the other.
and I had an egg sandwich, and I don't know if I gave myself insulin for it.
Well,
so
make sure you don't
diabetic
pass
problems.
out during the podcast.
So if you hear a couple little beeps, don't mind me. That's just me putting insulin.
Or if you hear a big thud, that's
No. Continue.
All right, so incorporated into many SLR systems, it was built into the camera bodies, and they had a little drive on them that would turn the actual elements in the lens.
Yes.
So it wasn't built into the lens. Nowadays, most autofocus motors are built into the lens, and they have different types of autofocus motors. Some are quieter than others, some are faster than others, but by and large, most of your autofocus systems are going to be contained in the lens. Another reason why lenses are pretty darn expensive these days.
I was about to just say that. That's why they're so expensive.
But on the other hand, it does provide some benefits. So just so you know, that's one little tidbit. As we mentioned before, autofocus does require lighting. It requires sufficient lighting so that you have a nice detailed thing for your camera's autofocus sensor to see, essentially. Preferably, it would be something that has contrast in it, because whether you're using a contrast detect autofocus system or a phase detect, you need to have something for it to look at.
Yes,
Something
absolutely.
with some detail on it. Again, like we mentioned before, if you're shooting just a big solid color background, manual focus is going to be the way to go. So, as I mentioned, phase detect, contrast detect, those are two different types of autofocus systems. And what the hell are they?
I don't know. You have the paper.
You're admitting that we don't know what we're talking about. We're just reading stuff off paper. That's not true.
This is one of those things that, like, you just kind of know how it works in your head if you studied it like a long time ago.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those things that are really hard to kind of explain.
Well, we're going to explain it very briefly because it is a very technical thing.
Yes.
There are two types of autofocus systems. One is called contrast detect. That is basically used in point-and-shoot cameras. And it is technically can be a little bit more accurate, but it is slower than phase detect, and it is, for the most part, not used on even entry-level DSLR cameras and mirrorless cameras. It's being phased out in favor of phase detection, which is faster and pretty much just as accurate in most situations. So contrast detect is something that basically looks for contrast and then jiggles around your lens to acquire the right autofocus.
Okay.
Phase detect actually has the autofocus detection on a specific sensor in a DSLR or on your image sensor in a mirrorless camera. It's built into the image sensor. And phase detect is a great system, and it has generally these days tons of autofocus points, so you can acquire your focus very quickly. And that's basically it.
Good explanation.
Phase detect is the wave of the future. Contrast detect, going out of style. And speaking of autofocus points, these days you can start with some cameras that have, 3, 9, something along those lines.
9's usually kind of like the happy place.
Yeah, for
the
entry
beginners.
level.
Yeah.
But then you have some that have hundreds of them, up to like 400. I've seen them up to 400 as of 2018.
Who's got the record right now? Who's in the lead? Is
the
it Sony?
Sony A6500 currently has the most autofocus points.
I think it's like Sony and Panasonic that are kind of like butting heads with this, right?
No, Panasonic uses a different type of autofocus technology
that's
called
right.
depth from defocus, and that's kind of a contrast detect system, and they don't use the same type of phase detect thing. But their autofocus is also very quick, so it's a different system, both very fast. And autofocus systems are kind of like where megapixels were a few years ago.
The megapixel wars.
You know how there was basically everyone was trying to one up each other by having more megapixels. And that was something that consumers would look for. Now
Not
it's
good for ISO.
now it's autofocus points and focusing speed. So we've got down to 0.04 seconds is like the fastest current autofocus speed. Of course, those are under specific conditions using a specific lens, and it's probably done in a lab with no dust in it or something like that. But super fast autofocus speeds are now possible, and that's basically where all the different manufacturers are trying to go at each other.
I want the ISO wars to start. I want better ISO noise control at higher ISOs.
You want less noise. I mean, they're doing we have a higher maximum ISO.
That means nothing.
But if it looks horrible, then that doesn't really mean anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We can bump your ISO up to 50,000, but you know what? You're never going to use it.
But as far as more autofocus points, that's generally better. So
Yes.
if your camera has more autofocus points, then that basically means it can acquire accurate autofocus over a wider area of the frame, and it will also have better tracking of your subjects.
Also, if you want to compose a picture a certain way, it's a little easier to do that as well.
Correct. So let's talk about that as we get into different autofocus modes. And this is basically how your camera is going to be focusing. Your first one, the one that you most usually use, the one that's going to be in your auto mode, is single shot autofocus.
There we go.
It's also known as
Now we're on
AFS, one shot AF, single servo. All the different camera makers have a different name
I
for
don't
it.
know why they just can't unify it under one name.
We like
Everyone's
single
gotta
shot.
Be different. Yeah.
AFS this is the thing I most normally see when people
Yeah.
are referring to it in shorthand. And what's that basically?
Basically, what happens is you press your shutter halfway down, it locks a focus point in, and then that's where it's focused before you press the shutter button.
Okay. So even if you move around, it's going to stay on that spot.
As long as you have the shutter halfway depressed, it's going to stay locked on whatever it locked on.
Okay. So those would be best for still subjects.
Yes.
If you're taking any kind of portraits.
But let me
go ahead.
Let me explain, just because I just have a feeling someone's going to get confused with what I just said.
Okay.
When you half press the shutter down, it's going to focus on a point, and that's where it's going to focus on.
These days you usually see a green box, right?
Yes. If you shift your camera, it's not going to still be focused on that subject. So if you move back a little bit, you're going to be out of focus.
Mm-hmm.
If you move forward, you're going to be out of focus. Basically, let's say your subject is like, I don't know, 8 feet away. It's going to lock on that 8 feet, and then as long as you're holding that shutter button down, that's where it's going to be locked.
Right.
It's going to be locked in for 8 feet. So
Yeah.
if you move left or right or up or down, it's still going to be locked in at 8 feet.
Right. Yeah, so you don't
Is that a
really
better
have to, you don't have
explanation
to
of
worry
it?
too much about left or right, but forward
Back
or
and
back
forward, yes.
is going to throw your whole
If you have
focus
a
off.
very shallow depth of field, though,
Yeah.
any movement you make is going to shift it. So just be aware of that, people.
And then your other basic autofocus mode is continuous autofocus, also known as AFC. It's also called AI Servo AF, which is kind of a weird one. Continuous Servo AF, again, they have different names for them, but generally continuous is what we call it.
Yes.
And that's really good for moving subjects. And where autofocus, single shot autofocus locks your focus, continuous does the exact opposite.
Yes, as long as you're holding the shutter button halfway down, it will continuously focus on the autofocus point you have selected or the entire screen where it's kind of
It's tracking a subject. Basically.
tracking a subject that the camera's
Identifying as a subject.
Yes.
Right. So if you have some, like I use continuous all the time when I'm taking pictures of my family, and if the kids are running around, then I switch it to continuous so that no matter where they go in the screen, no matter which distance they are from me, the camera will continuously run the autofocus motor to compensate for where they
Yes.
are in the frame. And that makes things much, much easier. And depending on your camera, of course, your autofocus speed will vary, but most of the time it does keep up pretty well. At least
Yeah.
these days it does.
So basically, you want single shot if you're staying still and your subject is staying still.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're moving and or your subject is moving, you want continuous.
Right. Now, conceivably, you could use continuous all the time,
You could.
and it probably wouldn't make a big difference if you have a still subject. But on the other hand, if you're shooting a still subject and you have continuous autofocus on, and then something like behind the subject flies into the frame,
It's going to try
it
and
might
focus
pick
on
that up because
Yep.
it's a moving subject. So it can be a bit of a hindrance, or you could just leave it in all the time and hope for the best.
And I believe there is one more mode.
Well, then you've got hybrid modes, I guess, right?
Yeah, so basically, I know Canon has it, and I think Fuji, because I'm not sure of specific cameras that have it. It's basically like a combination of single point and continuous. The camera kind of intelligently detects which one it should use.
Right. Yeah, you can have that in some sort of like intelligent auto mode or something like that, where it might be able to detect
Yeah.
if you have a moving subject in the frame.
Yeah, like I know Canon's called El Servo, I think.
Okay. But, I mean, primarily, the first two are the ones you're going to be using most of the time.
Yeah.
Single shot and continuous.
You kind of want to pick which one you're using.
Right. So those are the two main ways that your camera focuses, and then we have to determine as the user, as the photographer, where your camera focuses. And there are a couple main modes for that. Number one would be single point AF, and you basically have full control over the point in the frame where your camera focuses. Now, how would you use that, and what's it good for?
Well, basically, single point is you're going to get one little box in your viewfinder or on the back of your LCD that you can move around.
And when you
it's
say box, it's a pretty small box.
Yeah, it's a pretty small box, so it's this is like for pinpoint autofocus on where you want to get like a specific subject or a specific part of a subject in focus.
Right.
So you can shift that around, and let's say you're taking a picture of your kid, or like like a nice portrait or something like that. Rule of thumb is you really don't want them in the center of the photo because it's kind of like visually boring.
Yes.
It's kind of like how you always view things. So if you want to get like a little artistic, or you want it to stand out a little more, you put your subjects off to the side.
Yes.
That
Give them
way-
a little bit of nose room, as
Yes.
we say in the video field.
So you would basically shift. You would have them. Let's say you have your subject stand on the right side. You would want to shift your single point to the right side.
Right, and you can move that focus point either with a little joystick or a control pad on the back of your camera.
Yes.
Sometimes you can even use the touch screen to move the focus point. And once you move it to the desired place, that's when you depress your shutter halfway down and your focus will go on the exact point you want.
Yep.
So that's, like you said, for portraits it's great because then you can get the eye, which sometimes doesn't happen when you're using regular
Yes.
autofocus on its own.
When you're taking portraits, always aim for the eye.
Yeah, you don't want, if your subject has a particularly big schnoz, sometimes your autofocus will hit that schnoz.
Yes.
And that's not the part of the subject's face that you want to aim for.
I'm Greek. I have a big nose.
I do as well.
Are you Greek?
I'm
You're
not Greek, but I'm cursed with the schnoz.
Yeah. We can smell good, though.
Great. That works for me when I sit next to the bathroom here at work.
Yeah, it is pretty funny.
And then as far as autofocus areas, you've got areas. You have single point, and then you
Yep.
have area autofocus.
Yep.
And there's different areas that you can choose from, but essentially what it does is basically give you a group, right? A group of autofocus points.
A
that you
group
can-
of a group of focus points, so you have just basically a little more range than just a single autofocus point. Like if you know your subject is going to kind of be at a distance, but it's going to be on the right side, you can almost have like all of the single points on the right side grouped up. It's to catch it on the right side.
Yep.
Or
you
left
can
side, or
also
the top, or the
yeah,
bottom.
You can place them anywhere, and you can also have static groups that are made for like different situations. There's like a wide area. There's a center cluster area. What do they call that? Center weighted, right?
Center weighted, yeah.
So there's different groups that you can choose from, and of course, as it is with every subject, it varies upon which manufacturer you're using, when the camera was made, blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
But it's really useful for you as a photographer, as a beginning photographer, to cycle through all of your different autofocus options and try them all out and see what works for you in different situations, because just changing your autofocus method can improve your photography by leaps and bounds. You know, putting it on auto and allowing the camera to do all the work can give you nicely exposed pictures. It can give you stuff that looks really nice, but it won't work for you in all situations, and that's when knowing enough about autofocus modes and different types of autofocus will come in very, very handy.
And with that said, there is one last autofocus mode, which is the wide.
Oh.
We didn't mention that one.
Oh. Well, please do.
Well, I just did.
Well, let's say something more.
Just wide. Basically that...
Well, yeah, it's basically like the full frame, right?
Yeah, basically all autofocus points are active, and the camera will try and pretty much automatically pick up what it thinks your subject is.
Okay. So it's almost like an auto...
It's like basically like a full autofocus.
Right. And that's usually sort of by default is what you're going to
that's usually as default, yes.
Easy there. All right, so there's a few different little bits of technology that have been introduced in the last, 5-6 years or so. And these are a few things that are going to help you when you're using autofocus. Number one is going to be face detection, which pretty much every camera has now to varying degrees of success. But face detection is something that works really well when you're trying to capture, obviously, people. I don't think it works so well on
people,
animals.
Candids. Yeah, animals is kind of hard. They really should implement that, though.
I mean, it does basically look for like a triangle, right?
Yeah, basically it looks for the triangle that your nose and your eyes make.
Right. And the face detection works well when you're trying to capture candid moments, of course. And the only drawback I ever have with face detection is sometimes it doesn't lock onto the eyes. So if you're shooting with a really shallow depth of field, it might not give you the exact focus plane that you want, and you might end up having one of those Schnazzola portraits.
Which is why there is eye detection in a lot of systems now as well.
Yep. So more recently introduced is IAF, and it actually does look for the eyeball and focus right on that eyeball. So if you are shooting with a very shallow depth of field, say if you're shooting at an f1.8, it should be able to pick up eyes, and it'll give you little autofocus points,
around the
little
eyes.
Green rectangles on your subject's eyes
To let you know it's locked in.
Yep. And as long as you're, and I think that actually it switches basically over to a continuous mode, right? As it's doing that.
Depends on the system.
Okay. One would expect that's the case because your subject's eyes may be moving ever so slightly.
Yeah, but I mean, like if you're taking like a photo op kind of picture where everyone's just kind of standing there and you're locking it in and no one's moving and you kind of jump in, you set like a self timer or something like that, it's not going to continuously autofocus just because your f-stop's probably going to be pretty decent depth of field.
Okay.
So it shouldn't shift too much.
But that being said, eye autofocus is a really cool feature, and I just realized that it was actually available on my A6000, which at this point is 3 years old. It's just buried in a menu, and I had no idea it was there. I thought it was more recent development than that. But try it. It works really well in most cases, especially these days with more advanced cameras, and you will definitely be able to lock onto your subject's eyes better and with better success.
It gets a little finicky if you're in like a situation where there's a lot of people, though.
Well, yeah, I can imagine that might be an issue. I think it's meant for sort of
small groups,
one subject at a time.
Yeah.
So the other type of autofocus feature that I'm familiar with but have never used is called back button focusing. Now, the name implies that you use a button on the back of your camera for focusing, and that's exactly what it is, but I've never really used it, and I don't really know how it helps. Maybe you can enlighten us, please.
All right, I'll try my best. It's hard to do on just like a podcast where you can't like physically show people, but basically, like I said before, when your autofocus is engaged by half pressing your shutter button down, so you
that's the normal way of doing it.
You press it down like halfway. It doesn't quite take the picture, but you hear the autofocus motor and everything going.
Can I just, before we continue on, can I just note that it seems that nobody knows that?
I know everyone just like presses it down.
Whenever you give your
way.
camera to somebody, to a stranger, and you say, "Hey, can you take a picture of us?" and they're more than happy to oblige, they have no idea that pressing the button halfway down will autofocus the camera.
We have to also consider that a lot of people don't use cameras.
I know
it's
but they
hard to
weren't-
believe.
They weren't
but-
all born in the age of smartphones. Like most, I don't give it to teenagers to take pictures of me.
Yeah,
I give
well,
it
I
to
mean, like,
people who
if
grew
people-
up with cameras.
Yeah, but some people never use them.
It's frustrating.
Just like some people never drive stick.
Oh, that's true. How dare you?
I know that's sad.
I know.
But anyway, back on subject.
You know, manual
Alright.
transmissions have basically.
Oh, I guess we're not.
Well, now it's paddle shifters, right? That's kind of the thing to have dual clutch transmissions. I had a Subaru that had a paddle shifter, but it wasn't a real paddle shifter. It didn't have a dual clutch. It had a CVT in it.
I have a Subaru with the same things, and I never use them.
Oh, you have the paddles
I
too?
have the paddles, yeah.
And it's just like, here, let's give you a fake gear so you'll be satisfied. But it's not really an actual gear on a CVT.
But I mean, isn't that to kind of like help if you want to like get up a hill or if you're in like snow or something like that? You could just kind of throw it into the gear you want.
Yes. I've never found it to be that useful though. I guess it's kind of cool in theory, but
Anyway.
but we should all be driving stick.
Anyway, not on Long Island. Anyway.
No, that's true. When you're stuck in traffic like we were today, not such a great idea.
Okay, but yes, autofocus.
You were saying
I
about
mentioned cars, and
bat
I bit my tongue as soon as I mentioned cars because I knew you were going to go off on a rant. But anyway, yes, back button focus. When you press the shutter button down on the front of the camera, you press it halfway down.
Mm-hmm.
That engages your autofocus mode no matter what it is. It also it also engages your metering, but that's another
That's
subject.
a whole other podcast.
Yeah. So basically, what back button focuses does is it takes your autofocus from that shutter button and puts it onto a back button on the back of your camera. So instead of pressing your shutter button, you can focus with the back button on your camera.
Okay, so then what does the shutter button do?
The shutter just engage when you press the shutter button now, it'll only engage metering,
Okay.
and then when you fully depress it, it fires the picture.
Okay, so the metering gets your exposure.
Yes.
Okay, so focus with the back button, meter with the shutter button, and then push down fully to fire. Now, that seems like more work to me.
It is, but once you master it,
Mhm.
it really helps with your photography and your composition.
Okay.
It'll mainly help people with older cameras, like older digital SLRs that have fewer focus points. And it also helps people that will like to use single point, like right dead center of the camera.
Okay.
Which in any camera, just a little tidbit, any camera, the center autofocus point is the most accurate autofocus point,
Oh,
no matter what.
I wonder why that is.
And I'm not entirely sure why, but I just know it's the most accurate out of all of them. I used to have a 5D Mark II, and if I put my autofocus point all the way to the left or the top or the bottom or the right, the auto, even on like the best lens I had, like the $2,000 like 70 to 200 lens.
Well, I guess most lenses have a little bit of softness as they get out towards the edges, right? So maybe that has something to do with it?
A little bit, but it's I feel like it shouldn't really kind of affect the autofocus,
Okay.
especially if it's an expensive lens and camera.
Hmm.
But it's just the way
Never had any
some of
of
those.
those.
Yeah, it's just the way some of the cameras are. Like the left and the right, the up and the down. Like the focus will kind of struggle
Okay.
the further away you go from the center.
All right, so that being said, the back button focusing helps how?
Basically, the way you would do it is you would set your front focus. I mean, you would set your focus point to be your center one, your most strongest autofocus point.
Mm-hmm.
You get the focus. You focus it on the back. You focus on your sub. Blah, blah, blah.
Take two.
My throat's getting dry. All right,
Have some coffee,
I'm gonna
please.
take a sip of
See if you
coffee
can
here.
make that sound again.
Can't do
No.
it. But anyway,
Disappointed.
basically, if you're taking a picture of somebody and you want to compose it differently, you don't want it to be center. You want them to be off to the sides, but you want to make sure your autofocus is snappy and quick. Use your back button to focus on them, dead center, like focus on their eye or something like that. Well, focus on their eye, not something like that. You want to focus on their eye,
Definitely focus on their eye.
and then you would recompose them after you press the button.
Okay.
After you get your focus and put them off whatever spot you want in your frame.
Now, some people would say, all right, well, why don't you just move the autofocus point? Well, because two reasons. Like you said, the center one is the most accurate.
Mhm.
And number two, it can be slower to move your autofocus point than it would be to just shift your camera
Yeah.
a fraction of an inch over to the left after you've already acquired focus.
I can say I'm a lot more snappy with just focusing and moving my composition than moving my autofocus point than having to move it back somewhere else.
Yeah. All right, so that appears to be a useful feature, and I think for people who shoot a lot of run and gun kind of style, back button focusing is probably going to be most useful. It's not one of those things that you put your camera on a tripod and you're like, yes, this is a great feature.
It has another bonuses to it, but I can't figure out how to explain it because it's just one of those things where you
gotta try it.
You play around with it, you're like, oh my god, yeah, that's so much easier to like track somebody when I can just hold the back button and let go when I need to and then fire the picture.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain, but once you try it out, it's for people, it's not for people. It depends on your shooting style. So I just suggest trying it.
All right. Yeah, let's leave it at that. Give back button focusing a try if your camera has it. And most DSLRs and mirrorless cameras have some form of it. Even if you have to map it to a custom button or something like that, most cameras will be capable of it, I think.
And also depends on the camera you use. Like my little mirrorless camera, I don't have the back button focus, but on my digital SLRs I do.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I feel like with an optical viewfinder, I want more. I feel like the autofocus isn't as good as my mirrorless. So I like to keep it on my center focus point, and that's just the way I was used to shooting my digital SLR since I learned.
One little thing that we might want to just quickly touch on is autofocus using an optical viewfinder versus autofocus using an electronic viewfinder or a live view monitor. Just from your personal use, and again, you primarily use Canon and Nikon DSLRs,
Yes.
and Fujifilm mirrorless.
Yes.
So obviously they have different autofocus systems and everything, but what do you notice as like benefits of using an optical viewfinder versus a live view monitor or an electronic viewfinder?
With my digital SLR setups, I feel like my autofocus is I feel like my autofocus is faster with my digital SLRs. I just feel like it's a lot more snappy. It catches focus faster.
Mm-hmm.
And with my mirrorless, I feel like if I'm using like full frame, like the full spectrum autofocus, it's like just on automatic. I feel like it takes a little bit longer for it to catch focus.
Do you suppose that has to do with lighting and the way that an optical viewfinder works, or?
I just feel like it's just a limitation of the system right now, just because
that specific system then.
Yeah, like I bought the Fuji because I wanted a compact camera, and I knew that the autofocus wasn't going to be like professional grade for me as far as like having to track a subject like in dim light.
Okay.
Because when the electronic viewfinder gets like it's dimly lit, it makes the camera work a little harder to try and keep up with it because it has to boost the ISO to get a good shot.
Okay. So essentially, this is one of those you get what you pay for type things. I happen to, obviously I've mentioned this before on this podcast, but I'm kind of a Sony, not a fanboy, but this is the one that I can afford because we get a nice little discount.
But Sony mirrorless are really fast.
Yes, so I was going to mention that. Like,
in any situation.
I've got a 3-year-old camera at this point, and the autofocus, I'm not at a point where I figure, I need to upgrade this camera.
Yeah.
It's the autofocus is really fast and continuous and single shot, and it works really well for me. So I've never had a desire to switch over to a DSLR because of that. But then other people have different experiences. So I think the best thing to do would be to try out some cameras when you're shopping.
Absolutely.
And then when you're done trying them out, order them from Cometa.com.
And also research them online.
Yeah, do some research.
DP Review, that's digital. DP stands for Digital Photography Review.com. Does great comparisons on cameras. You can see different ISO, like examples on pictures. You can compare them to other cameras in like a little program they have on their website. It's a great resource, and that's where I go whenever I have to research a lens or a camera.
And it's definitely something that needs to be said to sort of wrap this whole thing up, is that focusing is probably the most important aspect in all of photography when it really comes down to it, because what's the number one complaint that people have if they don't like their camera?
My pictures are blurry.
My pictures are blurry. Like we said at the top of the show, there can be different reasons for that, but
It used to drive me nuts when I started.
if you aren't able to acquire focus quickly enough on the points that you want on in your composition,
You're going to miss the shot.
then not only do you miss the shot, but you're going to be disappointed with your camera. You'll probably end up hating photography. And not only will we lose you as a customer, the world will be a worse off place because there's less people who are have
artists.
a camera in their hand
Yep.
and are participating in the art. So it's good to learn as much as you can about autofocus and practice as much as you can and figure out different ways that different autofocus modes and methods will work for you.
And practice in manual.
Yeah, practice in manual.
Manual is actually a lot easier. I don't know if we touched on that. Manual is a lot easier to use on a mirrorless camera versus a digital SLR.
We did mention that now you can zoom in basically, and
Okay, yeah, we did.
so yeah. Whereas a DSLR with an optical viewfinder, you don't have a magnified view. You just kind of have to use your eyesight and see if you can guesstimate where that focus point is going to. You're going to say something.
I am, but finish your thought.
And then on a mirrorless, you can literally zoom in. It's basically, like blowing up the picture, but you get a detailed look at exactly what point you want to focus on, and then you can fine-tune it using manual focus.
Yes.
But
And I just forgot about this, and I'm pretty sure your camera has it too. They have manual focus assistance.
oh, yeah, that's what I meant.
Like my favorite to use is focus peaking.
Oh, that's focus peaking.
Yes. So basically what that does is when you're in manual focus, when you get to a point where the camera's like, all right, I'm seeing some sharp details, it'll actually highlight the parts that are in focus in a bright color.
Yeah, with a nice obnoxious pink or
a pink, a white,
yellow
a blue,
or
a
something.
yellow. You can set it depending on your camera.
Yeah.
And it really helps a lot. There's also split image, which is reminiscent of film days.
Oh, with
where
the
you-
old focusing screens where you have to
Yep,
line
they have
the images up.
digital split image. So basically, what that does is, in order to get a focus, you're going to be looking for lines in your photo. And
But
if
is
it's
that just for nostalgia?
no, it works.
I know it works, but I mean, is it any better than any other method?
It's accurate to me, and
Okay.
it's fun to use. So why
I've never
not?
seen it. All
It's
right.
on Fuji. So basically, what that is if you have to look for a line in your image of where you want to focus. And if you're not in focus, that line is going to be split. It's not going to look like a complete line. It's going to be off.
Right.
So you need to turn your focus until that line is a complete line.
Right. And that was used mostly with rangefinders back in the day.
Yep.
All right. So lots of cool information for y'all to take home and put to use.
It's
you
funny
know?
because we thought that was going to be a short episode.
I know. We ended up just like blabbing on. By the way, I just want to complain a little bit more about transmissions.
Oh boy.
So my Volvo has this transmission. It's one of those, automatic, but with shift capability.
I'm going to look at dogs on Instagram.
Right. So it's a 9-speed, but you can shift up and down manually, and that's great. Except it doesn't go in the direction you expect it to, right? So when you have to shift up a gear to get, if I'm going from like second to third, I have to push forward. It doesn't feel right. You're supposed to pull back on it like they do in the movies, like right? It doesn't feel right. And then they have it, and it's different on an Acura. It's different on the Mazda that I used to have.
Get it right, people.
Is this not entertaining you, Nick? You're not interested in hearing about my 9-speed transmission that doesn't shift in the proper direction?
I'm not a car guy.
All
I'll
right.
fully admit it. I
So-
love my Subaru. That's all I have to say.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to Camera Academy. Now, let's just plug ourselves real quick. If you want to talk about the show, or if you want to give us some criticisms or some tips, or if you have any suggestions for future episodes,
Find us on social media.
that's right. We're on Facebook, so facebook.com/CometaCamera. We're also on Twitter,
At Cometa.
just at Cometa. And we're also on Instagram, although we don't do a lot of posting, but if we
Keep
can...
forgetting. That's my responsibility, and I fully take responsibility for that, not getting a lot of pictures up on there.
We're going to have to start coming up with some artsy stuff to take pictures of in this wonderful office complex. I did find a spider last year, and it was in a nice ornate web. And
We found like the little gecko, like the little lizards.
oh yeah,
outside.
we do. Imagine that we have geckos in Long Island, and I don't know how
Never
they
seen them before
They're
here.
probably not actual geckos. Probably some other kind of cold tolerant lizard. But
Yeah.
it's weird to see a lizard running around
Long Island.
around Long Island. It's very strange. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, you can also email us at social@cometa.com if you want to send us some harassing emails. We're more than glad. We will read them and possibly respond to them on the podcast.
And this will all be posted on YouTube as well, so you can comment there too.
Oh, yeah. If you ever want to catch us on YouTube, we put all these podcasts there, as well as other stuff that may be helpful to your camera buying whatnot.
Those are usually like scripted videos, though.
I'm starting to fall apart here.
That's why you should have coffee.
Can we end this video?
You have water. I have coffee. I'm good. I can go for another hour.
When I was a kid,
Let's go.
When I was a kid and we used to drink out of the garden hose.
Leroy Jenkins, which you've still never seen.
My neighbor used to go, "Water is nature's fruit juice," and I was like,
"What?"
I was like, "Fruit juice is nature's fruit juice."
No, water is nature's water.
I know. It didn't make any sense, and I was just like, "All right, well, enjoy your hose water. That's great." But yeah. Anyway, I'll just forget about that tangent. Thank you so much for listening to Camera Academy. And until next time,
we'll fix it in post.
How dare you step on my line,
I was going to try and do it with you. I was going to try. All right, ready? Come on, ready?
3, 2, 1. We'll fix it in post.
Yeah.
All right.
You did the yeah, too.
This episode needs a lot of fixing in post. So.
Nah, I think it's great. I think you should post it as it is.
Bye, everybody.
Later.